The rain was a kind of silence. It had been falling for 3 days over the gray slate roofs and waterlogged fields of their small, neglected corner of Northumberland, a persistent hushing sound that erased the rest of the world. For Cecily Thorne, it was the sound of her life, quiet, contained, and unchanging. At 35, she had stopped listening for anything else. Waiting was a luxury for the young, a habit she had painstakingly unlearned over 17 years of careful, disciplined resignation. She sat at her father Ra's worn mahogany desk, the one possession of value he had refused to sell. Before her lay the household accounts, a slim, discouraging volume. The spine was cracked, the pages thin, her pen scratched, a small, dry sound against the drumming of the storm on the window panes. Ink stained the side of her middle finger, a permanent mark of her station. She was not a lady of leisure, but the manager of a slow, genteel collapse. A poor, gentle woman, with opinions, was a luxury no household could afford, and one, with a ruined name and a head for numbers, was a contradiction the world had no place for. So she had made her own place, here, in this forgotten house, with its drafty corridors and the faint, persistent scent of damp wool and decay. Her father coughed from his chair by the fire, a thin, papery sound. More rain. Cecily afraid so, Papa, she said, not looking up. Her focus was on a column of figures that refused to align. The butcher's bill was a small insolence, a few shillings over, but it was a battle she would have to fight. Every shilling was a small fortification against the inevitable. The river will be up," he murmured, his voice trailing off as he drifted back into the doze that claimed most of his days. He had been a vibrant man once, full of laughter and fury. The scandal that had shattered his Dodora's life had not broken him, but it had hollowed him out, leaving this quiet, frail husk who watched the fire and remembered a world that no longer remembered him. The scandal. She rarely allowed the word its full shape in her mind. It was a murky, formless thing. From another lifetime, a girl of 18 in a white dress, a whispered lie in a London ballroom, a rivalous, jealous spite, given the weight of truth, a woman of questionable history. The phrase had followed her, a ghost in her shadow, all the way to this northern exile. The crime was not what she had done, but that she had been chosen for ruin. She dipped her pen, the scratching sound resuming its small, lonely rhythm. She had her father, she had a roof over her head, however leaky. She had this quiet, ordered life she had built from the wreckage. It was not happiness, but it was a kind of peace, a peace built on the foundation of expecting nothing. And for a long time that had been enough. The sound that broke the afternoon was so alien, she at first mistook it for a branch cracking in the wind, a heavy, rhythmic pounding, hoofbeats, struggling through the mud of their long, untended drive. No one ever came to Blackwood Grange. The butcher's boy came on foot and the vicar only when the roads were dry. Cecily rose, her hand going unconsciously to the neat coil of her hair. It was a gesture from that other life. The instinct of a woman who expected to be seen. She smoothed the front of her plain gray dress and went to the window, wiping a patch of condensation from the cold glass. Through the sheets of rain, a figure on horseback materialized from the gloom. A great black horse, its head low against the driving wind, its flanks heaving. The rider was a silhouette, a dark shape hunched against the storm, a heavy cloak streaming behind him. He did not look like a visitor. He looked like a man fleeing a battle or riding into one. He drew the horse to a halt before their door, the animal shuddering with exhaustion. For a moment, he simply sat there, his head bowed as if gathering his strength. Then he dismounted, his movements stiff but certain. He did not bother with the tethering post, just dropped the reins and strode toward the door. There was an authority in his step that the mud and the storm could not diminish. Cecilia's heart gave a strange, unfamiliar lurch. It was the beat of a forgotten drum. She knew that walk, she knew that set of the shoulders. She had not seen Alexander, the Duke of Ravenshaw, in 15 years. Not since the day he had married another woman, a beautiful, suitable woman, whose name had never been touched by scandal. He had been a friend, once, a boy who had made her laugh, a young man whose quiet approval had felt like sunlight. He was part of the world that had cast her out, a world she had taught herself to forget. The old iron knocker banged against the door, the sound echoing through the quiet house like a summons. Her father stirred, his eyes blinking open, confused. What is that, my dear?" "A visitor, Papa," Cecily said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil that had suddenly seized her. She felt a strange, cold clarity, the calm that comes when the thing you have spent your life bracing for finally happens. The past had ridden through a storm to find her. She walked to the door, her steps measured. She was no longer the girl of 18. She was the mistress of this small, sad house. She was 35 years old. She had stopped waiting. She pulled the heavy bolt and opened the door. He stood on the step, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead and dripping from the sharp line of his jaw. He had shed his cloak, and his riding coat was soaked through, clinging to the broad lines of his shoulders. He was older, of course. Lines of grief and command were etched around his eyes and mouth. The easy warmth she remembered in him was gone, banked down into something cold and hard and contained. He was not the boy she had known. He was a duke, a widower, a father, and he looked as though he carried the weight of all those titles like a suit of armor. His eyes, a startling, deep gray, found hers. There was no flicker of polite surprise, just a raw, unnerving focus. He noticed everything. He noticed the smudge of ink on her finger, the worn collar of her dress, the way she held herself perfectly still. And he noticed, she thought, the exact moment her carefully constructed piece shattered. "A Cecily," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, rough with weather, and something else. "Urgency." "Ah, you're Grays," she replied, her own voice cool and level. She gave a slight, formal curtsy, a gesture so out of place in the derelict hall that it felt like a parody. He seemed to flinch at the title. My horse is spent. May I have shelter for him?" Of course. She did not move aside. She was not a girl to be flustered by a duke on her doorstep. She was a woman who knew the cost of everything. The storm is severe." The storm is irrelevant," he said, his gaze flicking past her to her father, who was now struggling to his feet by the fire. "I need to speak with your father." A strange premonition, cold and sharp, went through her. This was not a social call. This was not an old friend seeking shelter. This was an invasion. He is not well, Your Grace." "I am aware," Alexander said, and the words were not unkind, merely a statement of fact. His gaze returned to her, and for a second she saw a crack in the granite composure, a flash of something desperate, something hunted. "It is a matter of great importance to all of us." She held his gaze for a beat longer, then stepped aside. This was her father's house. It was his right to receive a guest, even one who arrived like a harbinger of doom. Alexander strode past her, bringing the chill of the storm into the room. He walked directly to the fire, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the worn floorboards. He offered a slight, correct bow to her father, a Mr. Thorne. "I apologize for the intrusion." Our father, bewildered, could only nod. Your Grace. It has been many years." Too many," Alexander said, and the words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with all that was unsaid. He turned his back to the fire, his tall frame dominating the small, cluttered room. He looked at Cecily, then at her father, and then he delivered the blow. There was no preamble, no softening. It was as blunt and brutal as the storm outside. "I have come to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage," he said. "I need a wife. I need her. My household is in chaos. My children need a mother. I will settle a generous allowance on her and see that you are comfortable for the remainder of your days. I require an answer immediately. The trustees of my late wife's estate meet in a fortnight, and I must present them with a solution." The room went profoundly still. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the drumming of the rain, and the frantic, useless beat of Cecilia's own heart. Her father stared, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from the Duke to his daughter, his expression one of pure, uncomprehending shock. This was not a proposal, it was a transaction, a desperate bargain struck in the teeth of a gale. He was not asking for Cecily. He was acquiring a solution, a duchess to manage his nursery and placate his trustees. Cecily felt nothing at all. It was a strange floating sensation, as if she were observing the scene from a great height. She saw the powerful, desperate man. She saw her frail, stunned father. She saw the worn room, the flickering candlelight. And she saw herself, a woman of 35, who had been deemed worthless for half her life, suddenly presented with a ducal coronet, as if it were a sack of potatoes. I need her. The words echoed in the silent room. Not "I'll love her," not "I have missed her." Just that stark, brutal verb of necessity. He needed a cog for his machine, a manager for his crisis, and he had ridden through a storm to procure one. She, who had built a fortress of dignity from the ruins of her life, was being offered the role of a high-status housekeeper. Her father found his voice first. A weak, wavering thing. Your Grace, I do not understand. My daughter, your daughter, is the most capable, honorable, and resilient woman I have ever known, Alexander said, his eyes still fixed on Cecily. I knew it 17 years ago, and I know it now. This is not a proposal of passion. It is a proposal of respect and of dire need. There it was again. Need, his need, not hers. He was not offering to save her. He was asking her to save him. And in that moment, something shifted in Cecily. The shock receded, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. Not at him, not entirely, but at the sheer breathtaking arrogance of it. The assumption that she would be grateful, that after 17 years of silence, of exile, of building a life where she needed no one, she would simply fall into his arms. Because he had finally found a use for her. She took a step forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it cut through the room like glass. Papa," she said, her gaze never leaving the Duke's face. "Oh, would you be so good as to leave us? His Grace and I have matters to discuss." Privately, Alexander did not look surprised. He looked expectant, as if this was the first move in a game he had long prepared to play. Her father, looking between the two of them, the unyielding Duke and his suddenly formidable daughter, simply nodded and shuffled from the room, closing the door softly behind him. They were alone. The storm raged outside, a wild chorus to the sudden, charged silence within. "Before I answer anything," Cecily said, her voice low and steady, "you will tell me the truth, all of it. I do not bargain with half a story, Your Grace." He held her gaze, and for the first time, she saw the full extent of the exhaustion in his face. It was not just a ride, it was a soul-deep weariness. But his voice was firm. "Ask. Why me?" she asked, the question sharp and direct. There are 100 suitable, impeccable women in London who would leap at the chance to be your duchess. Women without a history. Because I do not want a suitable, impeccable woman," he said flatly. Want a partner. I have 3 children, Cicely. 3 children who are lost in their own grief, each in their own way. My eldest, Julian, is 15 and despises me. He guards his mother's memory like a fortress. My daughter, Eleanor, is 12 and has barely spoken a word since her mother's death 2 years ago. And Thomas, who is 7, is a whirlwind of chaos no governess has been able to contain. They have driven off 4 in as many years. My house is a tomb. It is run by my late wife's sister, Beatrice, who treats it like a shrine and stifles the very air in it. I need someone with strength, someone with patience, someone who understands loss. His gaze was unwavering. I need you. There was no flattery in his words. only a brutal, unvarnished honesty that was more compelling than any pretty phrase. He was not offering her a crown, he was offering her a battlefield. But she was not finished. And the trustees. You mentioned a deadline. A muscle tightened in his jaw. My late wife's fortune is tied to the children's welfare. The trustees are concerned about the lack of a maternal presence, about the instability. They have the power to appoint other guardians if they deem me unfit. Beatrice has been whispering in their ears. They meet in London in a fortnight. I must arrive with a wife, a duchess, someone unimpeachable in her new station. And a ruined spinster from Northumberland is your idea of unimpeachable? The irony was bitter on her tongue. A duchess is unimpeachable by definition, he countered, a flicker of the old commanding duke returning. Her past becomes irrelevant the moment she takes my name. The world will accept it because it must. She walked to the window and stared out at the gray, weeping world. He thought power could erase the past, but she knew the past was not a line in a ledger that could be struck out. It was a stain that sank deep into the fabric of a life. You were there, Alexander, she said softly, not looking at him. In that ballroom? You heard the whispers. You saw what they did. Atia, the silence behind her was heavy, thick with the weight of 17 years. When he spoke, his voice was rough. Yes. And you did nothing. It was not an accusation. It was a fact, stated as plainly as the accounts on her desk. A was 21, he said, his voice low. My father was alive. I was betrothed to another. I was a coward. The admission hung in the air. It was the truest thing he had said yet. A poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury, but a duke with a conscience was a rarity she had not expected. She turned back to face him. The anger had gone, replaced by a weary sort of clarity. He was not a villain, he was just a man, trapped by grief and duty, reaching for the one person he believed could help him. A man who had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. I will not enter your house as a decoration, Alexander, she said, her voice clear and strong. I will not be a ghost who is ignored until needed. If I am to be your duchess, I will be the mistress of my own home. Lady Beatrice will be removed. I will have full authority over the household, the staff, and the children's care. He nodded, his expression grim. Agreed. Of the children, she continued, her voice softening slightly, I will not be forced upon them. There will be no pretense. They will not be required to call me mother. We will not erase the memory of the woman they loved. Her portrait will remain. Her presence will be respected. My role will be to care for them, not to replace her. Is that understood? He looked at her, and in his tired gray eyes, she saw something shift. It was the moment he stopped seeing a solution and started seeing a person. He saw not the ruined girl, not the desperate spinster, but the woman she had become. A woman who, even when offered a duchy, would first bargain for the dignity of a dead woman and her grieving children. It is understood, he said, his voice quiet. It is more than I dared to hope for. She took a deep breath. This was madness. It was a leap into a storm far greater than the one raging outside. But as she looked at him, at the raw need and the flicker of long-buried respect in his eyes, she felt the first stirrings of something she had thought long dead, not hope. It was too fragile a word. It was a sense of purpose. For 17 years, her world had been this small, shrinking room. He was offering her a world of consequence. A world where her strength, her steadiness, her very self, might actually matter. One last condition, she said. Name it. You will come to my father with me, and you will not ask for my hand as a business transaction. You will ask for it as a man who seeks a wife he respects, and you will do so with the courtesy my father deserves. A slow, faint smile touched Alexander's lips. It was the first glimmer of warmth she had seen in him, a ghost of the boy he had been. That, Cecily, he said, will be the easiest condition of all to meet. She held his gaze. Then, Your Grace, I believe you have an answer. It was not a yes born of joy or love. It was a quiet, steady assent to a necessary alliance. But as she stood there, the mistress of her own terms, Cecily Thorne felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation for the first time in a very long time. She was beginning. The journey to Ravenshaw was a study in contrasts. They traveled in the Duca's carriage, a vehicle of such silent, lacquered perfection that it seemed to glide above the rutted roads that had defined Cecilia's world. Outside, the northern landscape was stark and beautiful, all muted greens and browns under a vast, cloud-strewn sky. Inside the carriage was a small, tense pocket of civilization, upholstered in dark blue velvet that smelled faintly of leather and Alexandra's austere cologne. He had kept his word. His proposal to her father had been a model of decorum and respect, leaving the old man flustered but deeply gratified. The arrangements had been made with breathtaking speed, a special license. A quiet ceremony in the drawing-room of Blackwood Grange, witnessed only by her father and Alexander's grim-faced solicitor, who had appeared as if from thin air. There had not been time for a new dress, for sentiment, for anything but the stark reality of the contract she had signed. She was the Duchess of Ravenshaw. The words felt like a costume she had not yet learned how to wear. Alexander sat opposite her, his long frame seemingly at ease, but she noted the tightness in his hands, the way his gaze kept flickering to the passing scenery, as if tracking the distance to his own prison. They spoke little. The vastness of what they had done lay between them, a chasm of unspoken history and uncertain future. He was polite, attentive, ensuring her comfort, but he was also distant, a man locked within his own fortress. She had bargained for respect, not warmth, and yet she found herself watching him, trying to reconcile the desperate man who had appeared in the storm with this cool, controlled aristocrat. Men do not always care to be seen, she thought, and dukes, perhaps, care least of all. Ravenshaw appeared abruptly, a great stone beast of a house crouching against a darkening sky. It was not beautiful. It was magnificent, a testament to centuries of power and wealth, with rows of dark, unblinking windows that seemed to watch their approach with a cold indifference. No lights shone in welcome. The house felt as though it were holding its breath. As the carriage rolled to a halt on the gravel drive, the front doors opened. A severe, middle-aged woman stood framed in the doorway, dressed in immaculate black. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, and her expression was one of sour disapproval. "A Lady Beatrice," Alexander said, his voice flat. He stepped out of the carriage and turned to help Cecily down. His hand was firm and cool around hers, a brief, impersonal contact. Alexander," the woman said, her voice thin and sharp. You did not inform us of your return, or that you would be bringing a guest." Her eyes swept over Cecily, a swift, dismissive inventory that took in her simple traveling dress and her lack of jewels. The unspoken assessment was clear, inadequate. "A Cecily is not a guest. Beatrice," Alexander said, his voice dropping a degree colder. This is my wife? Her Grace, the Duchess of Ravenshaw." The shock on Lady Beatrice's face was a brief, satisfying crack in her composure. It was there and gone in an instant, replaced by a mask of glacial propriety. Your wife. She repeated the words, laced with disbelief and a faint, insulting pity. How sudden! The details of my marriage are not your concern," Alexander said. "I have rooms prepared for the Duchess." The master suite, the master's suite was your late sister's," Beatrice said, her voice hardening. It has been kept as she left it. Then it will be unkept," Alexander stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Cecily is the Duchess now. She is the mistress of this house. Her authority is absolute. You will find your own position here, adjusted accordingly. I suggest you retire to your rooms." We will speak in the morning. Lady Beatrice paled, her thin lips pressing into a white line of fury. She gave Cecily one look of pure, unadulterated venom before turning on her heel and disappearing into the gloom of the great hall. The victory, if it could be called that, felt hollow. Cecily stood on the steps of her new home, the cold seeping through the soles of her shoes, and felt more an interloper than ever. She had won the first skirmish, but the chill in the air was the promise of a long, cold war. The house was a tomb. That was Alexander's word, and it was the right one. The great hall was vast and freezing, the furniture shrouded in dust covers, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and sorrow. A fire had been laid in the enormous hearth, but not lit. It was a house that counted its candles, a place where warmth was a rationed commodity. Alexander led her into a cavernous library. Here, a low fire smoldered, casting long dancing shadows over thousands of leather-bound books. The children will be down shortly," he said, his voice strained. They do not know. I thought it best to tell them with you, hear you. Thought it best to present me as an accomplished fact. They have no choice but to accept," she said, her voice quiet, not accusatory. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. It seemed the lesser of two evils. Before she could reply, the door opened. 3 children stood in the doorway, framed like a portrait of grief. The eldest, a boy of about 15, was a younger, rawer version of his father. He had the same dark hair and gray eyes, but his were filled with a hostile, defensive anger. He stood slightly in front of the others, his arms crossed, a self-appointed guardian. The girl beside him was pale and thin, with long, fair hair that fell over her shoulders. She clutched a small, worn book to her chest and stared at the floor, her entire being a study in retreat. This was Eleanor, the silent one. The youngest, a boy with a tangle of brown curls and a smudge of dirt on his cheek, looked from his father to Cecily with a wide, curious gaze, his energy a stark contrast to his siblings. "Stillness, a Julian, Eleanor, Thomas," Alexander said, his voice lacking its usual command. He sounded like a man navigating a minefield. "I would like you to meet someone. This is the Duchess of Ravenshaw. She is my wife." The silence that followed was absolute. Juliana's face hardened into a mask of contempt. Eleanor flinched, hugging her book tighter, her shoulders hunching as if against a physical blow. Only little Thomas seemed unfazed, his head cocked to one side. You have a new wife?" Thomas asked, his voice piping and clear. Is she to be our new mother?" No," Cecily said, stepping forward before Alexander could answer. She knelt, bringing herself down to the little boyish level, ignoring the hostile glare of the older brother. No, I am not your new mother. No one can replace a mother who was loved. My name is Cecily. Your father and I are married, and I have come to live here with you." Thomas considered this. Will you send me to my room if I track mud in the hall?" I imagine I will ask you to help me clean it up," she said with a small, steady smile. A flicker of interest crossed his face, but Julian stepped forward, his voice dripping with scorn. How touching! A new governess with a grander title. Do you think we are fools? He has married you to satisfy the trustees? You are a convenience. Nothing more. Julian, Alexander's voice was sharp. Am I wrong, father? The boy shot back, his eyes blazing. Did you love her, or did you simply purchase her? Purchase her. The word was a slap. Cecily felt the blood drain from her face, but she held her ground. She rose slowly, her gaze meeting Juliana's. She did not answer his question. She did not defend herself. She simply looked at him, her expression one of quiet, sorrowful understanding. Your grief is a fortress, Julian," she said softly. "I will not try to breach its walls, but I will not be your enemy. I am here, and I will stay." As she turned and looked at Eleanor, who still had not lifted her head, she saw the title of the book the girl was clutching. "A Compendium of English Flora. That is a wonderful book," Cecily said gently. The illustrations of the wild orchids are particularly fine. There is a type of helleborine that is said to grow only in the north. I have always wanted to see one ash. For the briefest of moments, Eleanor's head lifted. Her eyes, a pale, frightened blue, met Cecilia's. There was a flicker of something, a curiosity, surprise. Before she looked away again, her curtain of hair falling back into place. It was a start. A crack of light, no bigger than a pinprick in a wall of darkness. She stayed. That became her silent motto, the core of her strategy. Where others had tried to charm, to discipline, to cajole, Cecily simply endured. She was a quiet, constant presence in the cold, grieving house. The first weeks were a trial of patience. Lady Beatrice remained, a silent, malevolent force, her presence a constant reminder of the late Duchess. She had been demoted but not banished, and she watched Cecilia's every move with an eagle eye, waiting for her to fail. The staff was polite but distant, loyal to the memory of their former mistress and her sister. And the children remained a constellation of grief, each orbiting the black hole of their loss, in their own way. Cecily did not force herself upon them. She began her days in the estate office, a small, cold room that had been long neglected. With the taciturn steward Mr. Hobbs, she began to unravel the tangled mess of the Ravenshaw accounts. This was a language she understood. Ledgers and receipts, debts and assets. It was clean, logical, and honest. She found discrepancies, small and large, evidence of years of mismanagement, and perhaps, she suspected, petty fraud on the part of suppliers. Mr. Hobbs, a man of few words, watched her with grudging respect. "You have a head for it, Your Grace," he admitted one afternoon, after she had uncovered a pattern of overcharging from the granary that stretched back for years. My father's fortunes were precarious," she said simply. One learns what one must." He understood. In that small, shared understanding of necessity, she had found her first ally. Her afternoons were for the house. She did not try to change anything. Not at first. She simply learned its rhythms, its sorrows. She learned that the west-facing drawing-room, shrouded in heavy velvet curtains, was where the late Duchess had liked to sit, and that the sunlight had been banished since her death. One morning, quietly, Cecily drew back one of the curtains. She did not fling them open. She just let a single golden shaft of light into the dusty air. Lady Beatrice swept in an hour later and closed it, her lips a thin line. The next day, Cecily opened it again. It became a silent, daily battle, a war fought over a single beam of light. She did not press the children. She learned Juliana's schedule, knew that he spent hours in his father's library, reading history and poetry. She would sometimes enter, select a book for herself, and sit in a chair across the room, the two of them sharing the space in a silence that was, by slow degrees, becoming less hostile and more companionable. She never interrupted him, never asked what he was reading. She just let him be. Her quiet presence, a silent statement that she was not afraid of his anger. For Eleanor, she took a different approach. She found a newer, more detailed botanical guide in the library and left it on a table in the hall she knew Eleanor would pass. The next day, it was gone. A week later, as Cecily was walking in the neglected gardens, she saw Eleanor near the old stone wall, the new book open in her lap, her finger tracing the illustration of a climbing rose. Cecily did not approach. She simply changed her path, giving the girl her solitude, but she felt the small, quiet victory of it. Thomas was the easiest and the most exhausting. He was a small, lonely boy, starved for attention, good or bad. He tested her constantly, tracking mud, hiding her sewing basket, releasing a frog in the morning room. Each time, she responded with unruffled calm. She did not scold or punish. She simply handed him a cloth and had him help her clean up the mud. She sat with him and mended the spilled contents of her basket. She caught the frog in her hands and carried it back to the garden with Thomas trailing wide-eyed behind her. "You are not afraid of frogs," he asked, impressed. Frogs are very useful creatures, she said. They eat the slugs that would otherwise eat our cabbages. He began to follow her around a small chattering shadow. He would bring her things, a shiny rock, a fallen feather, a wilting wildflower, and she would accept each one with a grave seriousness that delighted him. Alexander watched all of this from a distance. He was a ghost in his own home, consumed by the business of the estate and the duties in London that frequently called him away. When he was at Ravenshaw, he would appear in the evenings, drawn to the library where Cecily often sat with Julian, or to the study where she worked on the accounts. Their conversations were stilted at first, confined to estate matters. But slowly, a different kind of talk began to surface. Mr. Hobbs tells me you have saved us over £200 this quarter," he said, one evening, standing before the fire in the study. Not looking up from the ledger, he simply needed someone to look at the numbers with fresh eyes. "He says, you are relentless. I dislike being cheated," she said simply. "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. So do I," he said. And she knew he was not talking about money. He was talking about the lie that had stolen 17 years of her life. He began to tell her about his late wife, Amelia. He spoke of her with a sad, gentle reverence. He told her how Amelia had loved the sunlight in the west drawing-room, how she had filled the house with music. He spoke of her illness, the swift, brutal fever that had taken her, and the guilt he carried for not being able to save her. The silence she left, he said, his voice low. It was a physical thing. It filled every room. I didn't know how to fight it, so I let it win. I let Beatrice turn this house into a museum of my grief. A grief needs air, Alexander, she said softly. Not a sealed room. He looked at her, his gray eyes full of a pain he rarely let show. You are not afraid of it. Of any of it. The house, the children and me, I have lived in a quiet house for a very long time, she said. I am not afraid of silence. A fragile intimacy began to grow between them in those stolen, firelit hours. It was not love, not yet. It was a shared loneliness, a recognition of the wounds they both carried. He had married her out of need, but he was beginning to see her with something else, something closer to wonder. He noticed the way she listened, more than she spoke, the way her hands were never idle, the quiet strength that radiated from her like warmth from a low fire. He had thought he was acquiring a duchess. He was beginning to suspect he had found an anchor. The thaw came as thaws do, not in a great flood, but in small, barely perceptible drips. It began with Eleanor. Cecily had continued her silent campaign of the garden. She had the gardeners clear a small, overgrown patch near the south wall, a place that caught the morning sun. She did not plant flowers. She planted herbs, rosemary for remembrance, lavender for peace, thyme for courage, practical, useful things. One afternoon, she was on her knees, her hands deep in the dark, rich earth, when a small shadow fell over her. Eleanor stood a few feet away, her ever-present book held loosely at her side. She did not look at Cecily, but at the neat rows of green shoots. That is lemon balm," she said, her voice a mere whisper, rusty from disuse. "It is good for melancholy." Cecily's heart stopped. She did not look up, did not make any sudden move that might frighten the girl away. She kept her hands in the soil. Yes," she said, her own voice quiet and even. And it makes a very pleasant tea." Eleanor was silent for a long moment. My mother, she used to grow it." It is a good and faithful plant," Cecily said, carefully patting the earth around her fragile stem. It comes back every year, even after the harshest winter." The girl said nothing more. She turned and walked away. But the silence had been broken. A seed had been planted. From that day on, Eleanor would sometimes appear in the garden, when Cecily was there, a silent companion, her presence a question that did not yet require an answer. The next breakthrough came from Julian. He had found her, as he often did, in the library. She was not reading, but mending one of Thomas's shirts by the firelight, her fingers moving with a practiced, steady rhythm. He stood for a long time watching her. My mother did not sew," he said finally. It was not a criticism, just a statement. It is a useful skill," Cecily replied, biting off a thread. You are not like her at all," he said. No," Cecily agreed. "I am not." He walked closer to the fire. Beatrice says you're trying to erase her." Cecily put down her sewing and looked up at him, her expression serious. Julian. Purr. Look around this house. Her portrait hangs in the great hall. Her favorite room is as she left it, save for a single beam of light. Her music sits on the pianoforte. I have erased nothing. I have only tried to let in a little air, so that you and your sister and your brother might breathe again. He stared at her, his young face a mask of conflicting emotions. The anger was still there, but it was warring with a grudging respect. He saw the truth in her words. She was not a usurper. She was something else, something he did not have a name for, yet, my father seems different. Since you came in, he said. The admission costing him. How so? He speaks of her, Julian said, his voice low. Of my mother, he did not. Before. It was as if she had never existed. Sometimes, Cecily said gently. The only way to live with a memory is to give it a voice. He said nothing, but the hard defensive line of his shoulders softened. He did not storm out of the room. He walked to the shelves, pulled down a book and settled into the chair opposite her. The space between them was no longer a battlefield. It was becoming, slowly, a shared territory. And then there was the storm, not a metaphorical one, but a real, violent tempest that swept down from the north, rattling the windows and moaning in the chimneys. It was a storm much like the one that had brought Alexander to her door months before. The power of it seemed to break the last of the ice in the house. The thunder was a deep, rolling cannonade. Thomas, who had been putting on a brave face, finally broke. He came flying into the drawing room where Cecily was reading, his face pale, his eyes huge with fear, and launched himself into her lap, burying his face in her dress. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight. It is only the sky making a great deal of noise, my love," she murmured, stroking his hair. Just then, a tremendous crash of thunder shook the very foundations of the house. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness, save for the wild blue-white flashes from the window. Thomas let out a terrified wail. From the doorway, Eleanor gave a small, frightened gasp. It is all right," as Cecily said, her voice a calm anchor in the roaring dark. We are all safe." She held Thomas with one arm and reached out her other hand into the darkness. Eleanor, come here." A moment later, a small, cold hand found hers. Eleanor crept closer, allowing Cecily to draw her near until the three of them were a small, tight knot against the storm. My mother," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. She used to sing when there was a storm." Him, which one?" Cecily asked softly. For those in peril on the sea," the girl whispered. Cecily began to sing. Her voice was not trained or powerful, but it was clear and true, a thread of quiet melody woven through the chaos of the storm. She sang of lighthouses and steadfast rocks, of watching over those who were lost in the tempest. By the second verse, Eleanor's whisper-thin voice had joined hers. When the song was finished, the thunder had rumbled on into the distance. The worst of the storm had passed. In the ensuing quiet, Thomas stirred in her lap. Sing it again," he murmured sleepily. Cecily looked down at the boy, nestled against her, and the girl whose hand was still clutching hers. And in that moment, in the dark, storm-tossed house, she felt the first, true, undeniable warmth of belonging. Alexander found them like that. A servant had come with a candelabra, and the soft light illuminated the scene. Cecily, with his youngest son asleep on her lap and his silent daughter holding her hand. Her expression, one of serene calm, his two children, who had been lost to him in their grief, now anchored to this quiet woman. He stood in the doorway, and the look on his face was one of raw, unguarded emotion. He had asked her to save his children. He had not expected her to save him, too. But as he looked at her, at the quiet strength that had brought light and air and now music back into his silent house, he knew that was exactly what she had done. "You became the heart of this house," he thought, the words a silent, stunned confession. And he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he could not bear to lose her. Lady Beatrice saw the change. She saw the way Julian no longer looked at his new stepmother with contempt, the way Eleanor now sought her out in the garden, the way Thomas trailed after her like a devoted puppy. She saw the way Alexander looked at Cecily with an expression that was no longer just respect, but something deeper, warmer, and far more dangerous to her own precarious position. Her power at Ravenshaw had been built on the foundation of grief. She was the keeper of her sister's memory, the high priestess of sorrow. Cecily, with her quiet practicality and her refusal to be cowed by the past, was dismantling that foundation stone by stone. Beatrice had been relegated to the status of a guest in the house she had ruled, and she would not abide it. Her jealousy, which had once ruined a girl of 18, now curdled into a venomous resolve. She would not be made irrelevant. She chose her moment with a strategist's care. Alexander had been called to London, and in his absence, Beatrice announced she would be hosting a small dinner party. It was, she claimed, to formally introduce the new Duchess to their most influential neighbors and to the local trustees of the estate. It was presented as a gesture of goodwill, an act of familial solidarity. Cecily knew it was a declaration of war. "You do not have to agree to it," a Mr. Hobbs told her, his face grim when he heard of the plan. He had become her silent, watchful guardian within the household. On the contrary, as Cecily said, her voice calm, "I must to refuse would be to show fear. She has laid a trap for me, Mr. Hobbs. The only way through it is to walk into it with my eyes open." The night of the dinner was cold and clear. The house, for the first time since Cecilia's arrival, was ablaze with light. Beatrice had spared no expense. It was a glittering, theatrical display designed to evoke the glory days of the late Duchess and to highlight, by contrast, Cecilia's plainness. Cecily chose her gown with care. It was a simple dress of deep blue silk, unadorned by lace or excessive jewels. It was the best thing she owned, made over from a gown that had belonged to her mother. It was elegant, dignified, but it could not compete with the diamonds that glittered at Beatrice's throat, and it was not meant to. The guests were a formidable collection of county society. They were polite, of course. She was the Duchess, and rank demanded their deference, but she felt their eyes on her, their curious, assessing glances. She was a mystery, a whisper, a ruined spinster from the north, who had somehow captured the greatest prize in the county. They were waiting to see what she was made of. Beatrice was a consummate hostess, gliding through the room, her voice a silken thread weaving a web of innuendo. She spoke of her dear departed sister, her voice catching with perfectly timed sorrow. She spoke of the children, and the importance of protecting their delicate sensibilities. Every word was a carefully aimed dart. The blow came, as Cecily knew it would, over dessert. The conversation had turned to a young debutante who had made an unfortunate match. "Ah, yes, Beatrice," said her voice, carrying across a lull in the conversation. She placed a delicate, consoling hand on the arm of Lord Ashworth, one of the trustees. A young woman's reputation is such a fragile thing. Once stained, it is almost impossible to cleanse. One must be so very careful, especially when the welfare of children is at stake." She turned her gaze, full of false sympathy, on Cecily. The entire table went silent. Every eye was now fixed on her. The air grew thick and heavy. Indeed, Beatrice continued, her voice dripping with poisonous sweetness. I am sure her grace would agree. She has, I believe, some personal experience with the cruelties of gossip. It was here. The lie. The 17-year-old ghost. Summoned and given a seat at the table, Cecily could feel the blood drain from her face, the heat of 100 candles suddenly turning to ice. She could feel the weight of their stares, the avid curiosity, the faint, pleasurable horror of the scandalmonger. A woman of questionable history. The words echoed in her mind, as sharp and as cruel as the day they were first uttered. For a moment she was 18 again, trapped in a ballroom, drowning in whispers. Her hand, resting on the table, began to tremble. She curled it into a fist, her nails digging into her palm. The small pain a grounding anchor. She would not let them see her break. She had learned to build walls of composure, and she retreated behind them now. She lifted her chin, her eyes sweeping the table, meeting the curious, pitying, and hostile gazes one by one. She did not look at Beatrice. She looked at Lord Ashworth, the trustee. Guilty of what, Lady Beatrice? She asked, her voice quiet, but carrying in the profound silence. Of what history do you speak? It was a masterful stroke. She did not deny, she did not defend, she simply asked for the charge to be made plain. She called the bluff. Beatrice was momentarily thrown. She had expected tears, a panicked denial, a scene. She had not expected this cool, direct challenge. My dear Duchess," she stammered, I only meant the unfortunate rumors from your first season." "Ah, the rumors," as Cecily said, her voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel, "the ones that were never spoken to my face. The ones that had no name, no source, but were enough to see a young girl and her father banished in disgrace. Are those the rumors you mean?" She turned her gaze back to Lord Ashworth. A woman's reputation is indeed a fragile thing, my lord. It can be destroyed by a whisper, but a person's character, that is a different matter entirely. That is forged in hardship. It is proven by endurance, and it cannot be undone by a spiteful tongue at a dinner table. There was a stunned silence. She had not only weathered the attack, she had turned it back on her accuser. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been replanted. The trustees looked uncomfortable. The whispers would start again. Beatrice had won the first round. She had successfully framed Cecily, not as a duchess, but as a liability, a risk to the Ravenshaw name and to the children. The party broke up soon after, the guests departing with a flurry of polite but cool goodbyes. When the last carriage had rolled away, Cecily stood alone in the great hall. The house was silent again, but it was a different silence now. It was the cold, ringing silence of defeat. She knew what would happen next. The trustees would write to Alexander. They would express their concerns. They would pressure him for the sake of the children. For the sake of the estate, he would be forced to act. The letter came 3 days later. It was from Alexander. His script was a terse, angry slash across the page. He was returning to Ravenshaw immediately. But there was another letter. Tucked inside for her Cecily, it read, "I know what Beatrice has done. I am returning to deal with her. But the trustees are panicked. The old stories have been given new life. For your sake, and for the children's, I must ask you to do the hardest thing. I must ask you to return to Blackwood for a time. Just until I can silence these lies for good. It is the only way to protect you from the worst of it. This is a strategic retreat, not a surrender. Do not think for a moment that this is the end. This house was a tomb before you came. Do not let her make it one again. Wait for me." A strategic retreat. He called it that, but it felt like exile. Again, she was being sent away, hidden from view like a shameful secret. The pain of it was a physical blow, sharper than Beatrice's. Public cruelty. She had allowed herself to hope, and this was the price. She packed her small bag with numb fingers. The children watched her, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. You are leaving?" Thomas asked, his lip trembling. Only for a little while," she said, her voice thick. Because of what Aunt Beatrice said? Julian demanded, his old anger returning. But this time it was directed, not at her, but at the injustice of it all. Cecily knelt and took Thomas's small hands in hers. Sometimes in a battle, the wisest thing to do is to step back from the field for a moment, to let the smoke clear. She looked at Julian, and then at Eleanor, who stood silently by the door, her face pale as parchment. I am not abandoning you," she said. Her voice fierce with a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "I will be back." As her modest hired carriage pulled away from Ravenshaw, she saw them standing on the steps. 3 small figures growing smaller and smaller, watching her go, and in an upper window she caught a glimpse of Lady Beatricia's face, a pale oval, her expression one of triumphant, serene victory. The trap had been sprung, and she had been caught. Alexander did not ride through the storm this time. He rode into its heart. He returned to a house that had reverted to its former state with shocking speed. The curtain in the west drawing-room was drawn. The fires were banked low. A funereal quiet had once again descended. His children were withdrawn, resentful, and his sister-in-law was once again the undisputed ruler of the domain. He did not explode. His fury was a cold, contained thing, far more dangerous than any shouting rage. He summoned Beatrice to the library, the same room where he had first confronted Cecilia's quiet strength. "You will pack your things," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Ah, you will be gone by morning." Beatrice, emboldened by her victory, tried to brazen it out. "You cannot cast me out. I am your children, as only link to their mother. The trustees agree with me. That woman's presence here is a danger to them. The only danger to my children in this house, Beatrice, is you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You have fed on our grief like a carrion crow. You have used my children's sorrow as a weapon. And you have tried to destroy a good and honorable woman, not for the first time, out of nothing more than your own petty, withered jealousy, as she is a nobody. A ruined spinster. You dragged out of the mud, Beatrice shrieked, her composure finally shattering. She is my wife," Alexander said, the words like chips of ice. "And she is worth 10 of you." But casting Beatrice out was only the beginning. The real battle was with the trustees, with society, with the 17-year-old lie that had grown into a monster. He could not simply command it to disappear. A duca's power had its limits, especially when arrayed against the self-righteous certainty of gossip. He needed more than a denial. He needed proof, so he began to dig. He hired investigators in London, men as discreet as they were relentless. He set them to the task of unearthing the origins of a whisper from nearly 2 decades ago. He needed to know who had first spoken the lie, who had benefited, who had helped it spread. He was hunting a ghost. Meanwhile, at Blackwood Grange, Cecily waited. The days bled into one another, a gray watercolor of rain and silence. It was as if the past year had been a dream. She was back at her father's desk, the same thin account book open before her, but everything was different. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful, it was empty. The rain was no longer a comfort, it was the sound of her isolation. She had tasted life, purpose, a place where she mattered, and now it was gone. Her father watched her, his expression full of a helpless sorrow. He will send for you, my dear," he would say. Perhaps," she would reply, her voice betraying none of the aching doubt in her heart. A week passed. Then, too, a letter arrived from Julian, a stiff, formal note that nonetheless felt like a lifeline. He wrote that Thomas was inconsolable, that Eleanor had retreated back into her silence, and that the house was colder than ever. He did not say he missed her. He did not have to. At the bottom, in a different childish scrawl, were 2 words. "Come back." She wept then, for the first time since she had left. She wept for the 3 lonely children, and for the man fighting a battle for her honor and for herself, for the hope she had so foolishly allowed to bloom. In London, Alexandra's investigation bore fruit. It was a sordid, pathetic little story. The lie had originated with Beatrice. At 18, she had been wildly infatuated with a young viscount who had shown a clear preference for Cecily Thorne. In a fit of jealous rage, Beatrice had confided in a famously garrulous lady's maid, inventing a story of a secret scandalous rendezvous. The maid, eager for consequence, had embellished the tale and sold it to her next employer. The whisper had taken flight, growing more lurid with each telling, until it had become an unassailable fact. The Viscount, a coward, had quickly turned his attentions elsewhere. Cecilia's reputation was destroyed. Beatrice had not won her Viscount, but she had succeeded in eliminating her rival. Alexandra's investigators found the maid, now an old woman running a boarding house in Bath. For a price, and, with the threat of legal action, she wrote out a full confession, naming Beatrice as the source. They also found letters from the Viscount to a friend, lamenting the unfortunate rumors about Miss Thorne, but admitting he could not risk associating with her. The proof was undeniable. He did not send the proof to the trustees. He did not publish a retraction in the papers. That would be a quiet, private victory. He wanted more. Cecily deserved more. She deserved a public vindication. He sent 2 letters. One to Lord Ashworth, requesting an immediate and urgent meeting of the full board of trustees at Ravenshaw, and one to Cecily. It contained only one line. "The battle is about to be won. I need you beside me when it is." She returned to Ravenshaw not as a duchess in triumph, but as a quiet woman in a traveling cloak, arriving in a hired coach the evening before the meeting. The house was dark. Alexander met her in the hall. He looked tired, but his eyes burned with a fierce, determined light. He did not embrace her. He simply took her hand, his grip strong and warm. "I am sorry I sent you away," he said, his voice rough. "It was the only way I could be sure you were safe while I sharpened the blade." "Ah, what are you going to do, Alexander?" I'm going to tell the truth," he said aloudly, "and in front of everyone who matters." The next day, the library at Ravenshaw was filled with grim-faced men. The trustees, Lord Ashworth at their head, sat around the great mahogany table. Alexander had also invited the local vicar and 2 other prominent neighbors, who had been at Beatrice's disastrous dinner party. He had assembled a jury. He stood at the head of the table, calm and composed. Cecily sat in a chair slightly behind him, a silent observer. She felt strangely peaceful. Whatever happened now, he had brought her back. He had chosen to fight for her, not hide her. That, in itself, was a victory. "A gentleman," Alexander began, his voice ringing with authority. "You are here because of concerns raised about my wife, the Duchess of Ravenshaw. Concerns about a scandal that supposedly stained her name 17 years ago. You were concerned for my children, for the reputation of this house. You were right to be concerned. A lie is a dangerous poison. But you aimed your concern at the victim of the lie, not its perpetrator." He then, with cold, clinical precision, laid out the entire story. He read the maid's confession. He presented the Viscountess's letters. He unraveled the whole pathetic web of jealousy and spite, tracing it all back to one source. "A Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice dropping, has been a guest in my house for 2 years. All that time she knew that the woman my children were growing to love, the woman who was bringing my home back from the dead, was the same woman whose life she had destroyed out of petty spite as a girl." A stunned silence filled the room. Lord Ashworth's face was pale. The other men looked shocked, ashamed. They had been so quick to believe the worst, to condemn a woman based on a whisper. Alexander was not finished. He turned, his gaze finding Cecily. His voice, when he spoke again, was different. It was no longer the voice of a duke addressing his peers. It was the voice of a man, a Miss Cecily Thorne, he said, using her maiden name, forcing them to see her as the woman who had endured, not just the Duchess who had arrived. She endured 17 years of disgrace because of this lie. She lived in poverty and isolation, and she did so with a grace and a dignity that few of us could muster. when I was drowning in grief, when my children were lost, and my house was a cold, silent ruin, I went to her. Not because she was a convenient solution, but because I knew she was the strongest, kindest, most honorable woman I had ever known. He walked from the head of the table to stand beside her chair. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple public gesture of possession and protection, as she came into my home and she faced my hostile, grieving children. She faced the scorn of my staff and the poison of my sister-in-law. And she did not flinch. She met anger with patience, silence with warmth, and grief with understanding. She brought this family back to life. He swept his gaze across the stunned faces of the men at the table. This is my wife, he declared, his voice ringing with a fierce, unshakable pride. Her past is not a stain. It is a testament to her strength. Her character is beyond reproach. She is the Duchess of Ravenshaw, and she is the heart of this house. If any of you find her presence here objectionable, the door is that way. You may find your own way out. No one moved, no one spoke. The truth, spoken so plainly and powerfully, had obliterated the lie. In the silence, Lord Ashworth rose slowly to his feet. He looked not at Alexander, but at Cecily. Your Grace, he said, his voice thick with shame. On behalf of all of us, I offer our most profound apology. We have done you a grave injustice. He bowed, a deep, formal bow of contrition and respect, and one by one, the other men rose and did the same. It was over. The ghost had been laid to rest. The war was won. That night, a soft, quiet snow began to fall, blanketing the world in white. It was a cleansing, a hushing of the landscape after the long storm of the past weeks. The house was quiet, but it was a warm, living quiet. The trustees were gone. The truth had been told. Cecily stood in the library, watching the snowflakes drift past the dark window pane. She felt a profound sense of peace, a stillness she had not known was possible. She heard him enter the room, his step soft on the thick carpet. He came to stand beside her at the window. For a long time, they stood in silence, watching the snow fall. It is over, she said softly. Yes, he said. She turned to him. The firelight flickered across his face, softening the hard lines, warming the gray of his eyes. He was no longer a duke, no longer a general commanding a battlefield. He was just a man. Alexander, thank you, she said, for fighting for me. Cecily, he said, his voice low and raw. When I came to you at Blackwood, I told myself I was doing it for the children, and I was. They needed you desperately. But that was only half the truth. He took a step closer, his gaze searching her face. The deeper truth was that I was doing it for me. I was a coward 17 years ago. I stood by and let them destroy you, and I have lived with the shame of that every day since. Even when I was married to Amelia, a part of me never forgot. And after she died, the silence in this house, it was the sound of my own failure, my own emptiness. I could not bear it any longer. His voice broke, just for a moment. You were the only person who ever felt real. The only one I knew I could trust. I came to you for my children, but I stayed for myself. Her heart ached for him, for the long years of his own quiet suffering, but she had to be sure. She had lived on practicality for so long, she did not know how to trust anything else. Do not say you love me, Alexander, she whispered. If it is only gratitude, for the children, for the accounts. For slaying the dragon. A slow, sad smile touched his lips. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hand, his thumbs stroking her cheek. A gratitude? My dear Cecily, I have not cared about the accounts since the day you made my daughter speak again. I have not thought of dragons since I saw you sing my son to sleep in a storm. Gratitude is a pale, thin word for what I feel. He looked into her eyes, and all the walls he had built around himself crumbled. I love you, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had held back for a lifetime. I think I have loved you since we were boy and girl. I was just too young, too foolish, and too afraid to see it. I love you for the girl you were, and for the magnificent, strong, brilliant woman you are now. The woman who saved us all. Tears welled in her eyes. Tears of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to cover his. He bent his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, not at first. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was gentle and searching, and full of the quiet, aching truth of two lonely souls who had finally found their way back to each other. It was clumsy and true, not the practiced kiss of a duke, but the honest kiss of a man who had forgotten how. He held her, his arms wrapping around her as if he would never let her go. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the snow fell, covering the old world, making everything new and clean and bright. The storm was over. It came not just to the gardens, where Eleanor now worked side by side with Cecily, her face full of life, as she pointed out the triumphant shoots of the helleborine they had found near the woods. It came to the whole house. The great hall was no longer dim and cold. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating the warm colors of a new Turkish carpet. The west drawing room was the most used room in the house, its curtains always open, its air often filled with the sound of Julian reading aloud, his voice confident and clear, or with Eleanor's hesitant but sweet singing as she practiced at the pianoforte. Amelia's portrait still hung in its place of honor. Cecily had made sure of it. She was not a replacement, she was an addition. The house was large enough for all of their stories, all of their love. Thomas, who had long since dropped any formal address, came running into the library where Cecily was sitting at the vast desk. It was her desk now, though she still shared the space with Alexander. The boy scrambled onto her lap, his arms wrapping around her neck in a tight hug. "A Julian is going to teach me to fish," he announced proudly. Is he now?" Cecily smiled, hugging him back. Then you must be sure to listen to him. He is very wise about such things." Alexander came in then, and stood for a moment watching them. The weary, haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, quiet contentment. He walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch familiar and warm. He looked down at the open ledger on the desk. It was perfectly balanced, every column neat, every penny accounted for, a house in order, he said softly, his eyes smiling into hers. Cecily looked up at him, her heart full. She looked at the man she loved, at the child in her arms, and thought of the other two children, their laughter echoing from the garden. This was not just a house. It was not just an estate. A home, she corrected gently. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of love and forever. She was 36 years old. She was a wife, a mother, a duchess. She was the woman who had lived through the storm, who had refused to be broken. The woman who had been sent away and who had been brought back. She was the woman who stayed. And as the spring sunlight poured into the room, Cecily Thorne, who had long ago stopped waiting for her life to begin, knew that she was, at long last, home. What does it truly mean to find your place in the world? Is it a title, a house, or is it the quiet knowledge that you are seen and valued for exactly who you are? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from today? If this story of love and vindication touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more tales of romance and resilience. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. Let us know what your favorite moment was. Was it the tense dinner party, the dramatic courtroom-style reveal, or the quiet confession by the fire? We read every comment and love hearing from you. Until our next story, be well.